Steven Seagal felt his wrist lock countered for the first time in his life, and before he could reset, the challenger drove him spine first into the dojo wall hard enough to crack the plaster. 11 people stood frozen in silence as Seagal peeled himself off the wall, rolled his shoulders, and moved toward the man with an expression none of them had ever seen on his face before. What happened in the next 4 minutes would become martial arts underground legend, a story whispered about for decades. Steven Seagal's hand wrapped around the man's wrist and twisted it in a direction wrists don't go. The challenger, a 6'2" professional boxer with 23 wins and hands that had broken orbital bones, dropped to one knee on the dojo floor before he could even throw the punch he'd been promising all week. What happened in the next 4 minutes would become Los Angeles legend, a story whispered about for decades by the handful of people standing in that room, a story most of them refused to tell on camera, a story that only now, after 30 years of silence, has finally been pieced together from the fragments they left behind. Let me take you back. It's 1988. Steven Seagal is not yet a movie star. He's not the guy in the black leather jacket squinting at explosions. He's something more dangerous than that. He's a legitimate martial artist running a dojo on West Washington Boulevard in Venice, California, called Tenshin Aikido. And if you know anything about that era of martial arts in LA, you know the dojos weren't just schools. They were territories. Reputations were built and destroyed inside those walls, often in the same afternoon. Seagal had something that drove other fighters absolutely crazy. He was calm. Not the manufactured calm of a guy pretending he's above it all. Real calm. The kind that comes from having lived in Japan for 15 years, trained under masters whose names most Americans couldn't pronounce, and earned a 7th Dan black belt in Aikido at a time when no other Westerner had come close. He moved through his dojo like he owned gravity itself, and his students treated him like something between a sensei and a minor deity. Now here's what nobody tells you. That reputation didn't just attract students. It attracted challengers. Every few months, somebody would walk into Tenshin Aikido with something to prove. Usually it was another martial artist. Sometimes it was a guy from the street who'd heard too many stories. Most of the time, Seagal's senior students handled it. They'd bow, they'd spar, they'd escort the visitor out with a sore joint and a bruised ego. Business as usual. But this challenger was different. His name was Danny Greer. I need you to understand what Danny Greer was before you understand what happened to him. Greer was a professional middleweight boxer out of South Central, trained at the Hoover Street Gym, a place that produced killers, not metaphorical killers, guys who made other men bleed for a living. Greer had 23 professional wins, 14 by knockout, and he carried his fists like loaded weapons even when he was standing in line at a grocery store. He'd been talking for weeks, at bars, at gyms, at barbershops, telling anyone who'd listen that Aikido was a joke, that Seagal was a fraud, that wrist locks and throws were party tricks that would evaporate the second a real fighter closed the distance. He wasn't wrong to be skeptical, by the way. A lot of martial artists in that era felt the same way. The difference was, most of them just talked. Greer wanted to walk through the door. He showed up on a Tuesday evening. I swear this happened. The dojo had maybe 15 students training on the mat. Greer walked in wearing gray sweatpants, a white t-shirt, and boxing shoes. No gi, no bow. He stood just inside the entrance and said loud enough for the whole room to hear, "I'm here for Seagal." 4 students stopped mid-technique. A senior student named Marcus, a brown belt who'd been training under Seagal for 6 years, stepped toward Greer with his palms open. "Can I help you?" Greer looked past him. "I didn't come for you." Marcus kept his feet planted. "Sensei's in the back. If you want to train, we can get you a gi and—" "I don't want a gi. I want to see if your boss can fight." The room changed. Not the temperature, not the air. The posture of every single person on that mat shifted. Students who'd been practicing flowing wrist locks suddenly looked like they were calculating distance. This is what people don't understand about traditional dojos. They look peaceful, they look ceremonial, but the people inside them are trained to detect aggression the way a smoke detector picks up a match, and every alarm in that room was going off. Marcus didn't move. He kept his voice even. "We don't do challenge matches here." Greer took a step onto the mat without removing his shoes. In a traditional dojo, that's not rudeness. That's a declaration. You might as well spit on the floor. Believe me, Every person in that room knew what that step meant. Seagal appeared from the back hallway. He was wearing a black GI, his hair pulled back, moving with that particular walk he had. Not hurried, not slow, each step placed like he'd already decided exactly where his foot would land before he lifted it. He was 36 years old, 6'4", 220 pounds. His forearms were thick, his hands enormous, and his eyes settled on Greer with the flat patience of a man who'd done this before. "You're on my mat," Seagal said. Greer squared up, not a boxing stance, not yet, but his weight shifted to the balls of his feet and his hands came up slightly. "I'm Danny Greer. I box out of Hoover Street. I've been hearing about you for a long time and I came to see if any of it's real." Seagal looked at Greer's shoes on his mat. Then he looked at Greer's face. Then he did something that surprised everyone in the room. He nodded. "Take your shoes off," Seagal said. "Then we'll see." Here's the thing about what happened next. There were only 11 people left in that room. Marcus would later say that Seagal asked several students to leave before this went further. Not because he was worried about losing, because he was worried about what Greer was about to experience. 4 students gathered their bags and left through the side door. The 11 who remained were senior students and 1 visitor, a Japanese martial artist named Takeshi, who happened to be training there that week, and who would later provide the most detailed account of what went down. Greer kicked off his boxing shoes. He stepped to the center of the mat. He bounced on his toes twice, and his hands came up in a proper fighting stance. Right there, in that stance, you could see why he was dangerous. His shoulders were relaxed, his chin was tucked, his left jab was already cocked. This was a man who knew how to hit people, and he was about to try to hit Steven Seagal. Seagal walked to the center of the mat and stood in front of him. He didn't take a stance. His arms hung at his sides, his feet were shoulder-width apart. He looked like a man waiting for a bus. Get this. Greer threw the first punch. It was a jab, fast, professional grade. The kind of punch that had snapped heads back in sanctioned bouts, the kind that had opened cuts over eyes and separated men from their senses. Seagal moved his head 2 inches to the left. The jab went past his ear. Seagal didn't counter. He just shifted and waited. Greer threw another jab. Same speed. This time Seagal stepped offline. A small circular movement that put him at a 45-degree angle to Greer's shoulder. Again, no counter. Greer reset his stance and came forward with a 1-2 combination. The jab missed. The right cross missed. Seagal had moved again, barely, just enough to make Greer's fists find air. This went on for about 30 seconds. Greer throwing, Seagal moving, not blocking, not deflecting, just not being where the punches were. According to Takeshi, it was the most unsettling thing he'd ever seen on a mat. A professional boxer was throwing real punches at a man who kept disappearing by inches. And here's what was happening underneath the surface. Greer was getting angry. Each missed punch was a crack in his confidence. His combinations started coming faster, wilder. He was loading up more on his right hand. His footwork, which had started textbook perfect, was getting sloppy. He was chasing Seagal instead of cutting off the ring, and there was no ring to cut off. This was an open mat. Seagal had space in every direction, and he used it the way running water uses a hill. Effortlessly, inevitably, always moving downward into the path of least resistance. 45 seconds in, Greer threw a wide right hook. It was the first punch that wasn't straight. It was also the last punch he threw as a man who believed he was winning. Seagal stepped inside the hook. His left hand came up and met Greer's right forearm at the wrist. His right hand slid under Greer's elbow. In one motion, and I want you to understand, this was one continuous motion, not a sequence of steps. Seagal redirected Greer's arm, applied pressure to the elbow joint, and rotated Greer's wrist so that his entire body had to follow or his elbow would separate from his arm. Greer went airborne. Not a trip, not a sweep. He left the ground completely. His feet came off the mat, his body rotated in the air, and he landed flat on his back with a sound that every person in that room heard in their chest. The mat shook. The walls didn't, but it felt like they should have. Greer hit the ground and the air left his lungs in a rush. For a moment he lay there, staring at the ceiling, trying to figure out what had just happened to the world. Seagal still had his wrist. The lock was still applied. and Seagal was standing over him with no more expression on his face than he'd had when he walked out of the back hallway. Now listen, this is where most versions of this story end. Guy walks into dojo, guy gets thrown, guy leaves humbled. Nice, clean, satisfying. Except that's not what happened, because Danny Greer was not most guys. Greer rolled. He yanked his wrist free. Seagal let him, and that's important, he chose to let him, and Greer scrambled to his feet. His face was red, his breathing was ragged, but his hands came back up. Again, Greer said. Seagal tilted his head. A small movement, like a dog hearing a frequency it doesn't quite recognize. Marcus, standing at the edge of the mat, said, "Sensei, should I?" Seagal held up one finger without looking at Marcus. The gesture said everything. "Stay out of it. This isn't done." Greer came forward again. This time he didn't jab. He rushed. He closed the distance with his head low and his hands up, trying to get inside Seagal's reach, trying to turn this into a brawl where his boxing speed and power could matter. Seagal met him in the center. What happened in the next 8 seconds was, according to Takeshi's account, the most violent display of Aikido he had ever witnessed. Seagal intercepted Greer's leading arm, applied an Ikkyo lock, a foundational Aikido technique that controls the opponent through the wrist and elbow, and drove Greer face first into the mat. Before Greer could push himself up, Seagal transitioned to a Nikkyo wrist lock, rotating Greer's hand inward so that the small bones in his wrist ground against each other. Greer screamed, not yelled. Screamed, but he still didn't quit. You have to understand something about fighters like Danny Greer. Mark this. Men who come up through gyms like Hoover Street don't know how to quit. It's not courage exactly, it's wiring. They've been conditioned since they were 15 years old to keep moving forward no matter what. A broken nose is a decoration. A cut eye is a conversation piece. Pain is just information, and Greer had been trained to ignore information. He got up again. This time, blood was coming from somewhere on his face. His lip or his nose, accounts differ. His right wrist was visibly swelling. He stood on the mat, bleeding and damaged, and he raised his left hand in a southpaw stance. "Come on," Greer said. His voice was different now, thicker but steady. Something changed in Seagal's face. Takeshi described it later, and this is the part of the story that most people miss. Seagal didn't look angry. He didn't look excited. For one brief moment he looked concerned, not for himself, for Greer. He saw a man who was going to keep coming until something broke permanently, and the mathematics of the situation were simple and ugly. Seagal dropped his hands to his sides again. He took a breath. Then he spoke quietly enough that only Greer and the closest students could hear him. "You're a real fighter," Seagal said. "I respect that. But you need to understand something. I haven't started yet." No fooling. Those words hung in the room, not because they were dramatic, because they were obviously terrifyingly true. Everything Greer had experienced, the throws, the locks, the screaming wrist pain, had been Seagal operating at a fraction of what he could do, and everyone on that mat knew it. Greer knew it too. You could see it in the way his left hand, his one good hand, trembled slightly at the top of his stance. But Greer didn't step back. He came forward one more time. This time, Seagal met him differently. Instead of a redirection, instead of a lock, Seagal used an atemi, a strike. His open palm hit Greer in the solar plexus, not a full power blow. Takeshi was emphatic about this. If Seagal had hit him at full power, there would have been broken ribs, maybe a ruptured organ. This was a measured strike, calibrated to stop forward motion without causing permanent damage. Greer folded, his knees buckled. He dropped to the mat on all fours, gasping, his diaphragm in revolt. For 10 seconds, the only sound in the room was Danny Greer trying to breathe. Seagal knelt beside him. This is the moment. This is what the 11 people in that room never forgot. Seagal knelt beside a man who'd walked into his dojo to humiliate him, a man who'd disrespected his art, his students, his mat. And Seagal put his hand on Greer's back, gently, the way a father touches a child who's crying. "Breathe slow," Seagal said. "Small breaths. Let it come back." Greer's shoulders were heaving. His good hand gripped the mat. After about 15 seconds, his breathing started to normalize. He sat back on his heels. He looked up at Seagal, and whatever was on his face, pride, anger, disbelief, had been replaced by something raw and honest. "How?" Greer said. One word. That was all. Seagal stood up and offered his hand. Greer took it with his left. His right wrist was done for the night, and Seagal pulled him to his feet. "Your punches are fast," Seagal said. "Faster than almost anyone who's walked in here. But speed in a straight line is still a straight line. A circle always beats a straight line." Greer stood there, bleeding, swollen, breathing heavy. He looked around the room at 11 faces that had watched him get dismantled. And then Danny Greer did something that nobody in that room expected. He bowed. Not a martial arts bow. Not a formal Japanese bow. A slow nod of the head, deep and deliberate, the kind of acknowledgement that comes from a place beyond ego. The kind that costs something. Seagal bowed back. Same depth, same deliberation. Two fighters, standing on a mat stained with sweat and a little blood, paying each other the only currency that mattered. Take my word for it, that moment meant more than the fight. Marcus got Greer some ice and a towel. Seagal went to the back of the dojo. The remaining students stood in silence for a long moment before anyone spoke. Takeshi would later say he felt like he'd witnessed something sacred. Not the violence, but the resolution. The way two men who had every reason to hate each other found a language that worked. Now, here's where the story gets strange. Danny Greer came back to Tenshin Aikido the following Tuesday. This time he brought a gi. He took off his shoes at the door. He bowed when he entered. He trained for 3 weeks. Not as a regular student, more as a visitor, a guest. He showed up twice a week, trained with the beginners, let himself be thrown and locked by students who had a fraction of his physical ability. He never complained. He never challenged anyone again. Marcus said later that Greer was, in those 3 weeks, one of the most dedicated and humble students he'd ever seen on the mat. And then Greer disappeared. He stopped coming. No one heard from him. Seagal never mentioned him. For the 11 people who'd been there that night, Danny Greer became a story they told carefully, to the right people, in the right circumstances. Trust me on this. What makes a fight legendary isn't just the fight. It's the silence afterward. The way people hold the story close and only release it in pieces, in whispers, over decades. But the story didn't completely die. It couldn't. Because those 11 witnesses had lives, and lives involve talking. And talking involves bars and late-night conversations, and the occasional moment when someone says, "You want to hear something you won't believe?" 3 of those witnesses went on to become martial arts instructors themselves. 2 of them eventually spoke about it in interviews, though they disagreed on details. One said Greer threw 6 punches before the first throw. Another said it was at least a dozen. Takeshi, the Japanese visitor, wrote about it in a martial arts journal published in Tokyo in 1991, though his account was in Japanese and wasn't translated into English until 2004. By then, Seagal was a movie star, and the story got buried under a mountain of Hollywood mythology. Let me tell you what happened to Danny Greer. Because this matters. Greer fought professionally for another 2 years after that night. His record was mixed. He won some, he lost some, his right wrist was never quite the same. He retired from boxing in 1990 with a record of 27 wins, 9 losses, and 1 draw. He opened a small gym in Inglewood, California, and trained young boxers for the next 15 years. Here's the part that hits different. Greer hung a photograph in his gym. Just one personal photograph, among the fight posters and the motivational slogans and the pictures of his fighters. It was a photo of Tenshin Aikido's storefront, taken from across the street. No caption, no explanation. When his students asked about it, he'd say the same thing every time. "That's where I learned the most important lesson of my career." They'd ask what the lesson was. Greer would shake his head and wrap another fighter's hands and change the subject. He never told his students what happened that night. The photograph was the only confession he allowed himself. Greer died in 2012. Heart attack. He was 61. At his funeral, Marcus, Seagal's former senior student, was in attendance. The 2 men had kept in sporadic contact. Over the years, Marcus told me that he approached Greer's widow after the service and asked about the photograph from the gym. She said Danny had taken it down the year before he died and put it in a drawer. She didn't know why. Some stories don't end clean. Some stories just stop, and you're left holding the weight of them. But let me bring it back to that night, because the fight itself, the 4 minutes on the mat, the 11 witnesses, the silence afterward, that's what you came here for, and that's what matters most. What Steven Seagal did to Danny Greer wasn't just a martial arts demonstration. It was an answer to a question that fighters have been asking since the first man threw the first punch: what happens when a boxer meets an Aikido master? And the answer, at least on that night, in that room, with those two men, was definitive. Greer was faster. Greer was more experienced in combat. Greer was tougher than almost anyone Seagal had ever faced, and none of it mattered. You hear that right? None of it. Because Seagal wasn't fighting on Greer's terms. He wasn't trying to outpunch a puncher. He wasn't trying to match speed with speed. He was operating in a different language entirely, one where force wasn't met with force, but redirected, absorbed, and returned in forms the attacker couldn't anticipate. Greer threw straight lines. Seagal answered with circles, and every circle ended with Greer on the ground, wondering how the laws of physics had been rewritten without his consent. But here's the real legend. It's not the throws, it's not the locks, it's not the palm strike that ended it. The real legend is the hand on the back, the quiet voice saying, "Breathe slow." The bow between two men who just tested each other in the most honest way human beings can. That's the story the 11 witnesses carried with them. Not a story about domination. A story about what happens when skill meets courage, and both are real, and there's still room on the mat for respect. Now, if this story moved something in you, if you felt that moment on the mat, hit subscribe. Because there are more stories buried in the history of martial arts that the world has never properly heard, and I'm going to keep digging them up. One hidden fight at a time. Let me close with this. I tracked down Takeshi in 2019. He was 73 years old, living in Osaka, still teaching Aikido 3 days a week. I asked him about that night. I asked him what he remembered most. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said something I haven't been able to shake. "I've trained with masters all over the world. I've seen technique that would make you cry, but I've only seen one man make another man's anger disappear. Not suppress it, not overpower it, disappear. Seagal did that. The boxer walked in furious and walked out peaceful. That's not fighting, that's something else entirely." I asked him what he'd call it. Takeshi thought about it. In Japanese, we have a word, musubi. It means to connect, to tie together. Most people think Aikido is about breaking connections. It's about making them. Seagal connected with that boxer, through force, through pain, through honesty. By the end, they were tied together. That bow between them, that was the knot. One room, 11 witnesses. 4 minutes that none of them ever forgot. Steven Seagal has made 40 movies. He's been a cop, a Navy SEAL, a CIA operative, an environmental agent, and just about everything else Hollywood could dream up. He's been mocked, criticized, celebrated, and debated for 4 decades. But if you ask the people who were actually there, the ones who saw him on the mat, before the cameras, before the celebrity, before the controversy, they'll tell you the same thing. The most dangerous thing about Seagal was never his technique. It was his patience, the willingness to stand with his hands at his sides while a professional boxer threw everything he had, the confidence to absorb aggression without returning it until the precise moment when return was necessary, the restraint to end a fight without ending a man. Danny Greer walked into Tenshin Aikido to prove that Steven Seagal was a fraud. He walked out with a swollen wrist, a bloody lip, and a photograph he'd keep on his gym wall for 20 years. And Seagal, after it was over, said only 7 words that anyone could hear. Marcus was the one who caught them, standing at the edge of the mat as Seagal walked toward the back hallway. He had a good right hand. That was it. No victory speech, no lesson for the students, no analysis of what had just happened. Just a quiet acknowledgement of the man who'd come to challenge him, delivered to no one in particular, already halfway down the hallway and disappearing into the back of the dojo. 11 people saw it. Now you've heard it. And that Tuesday night in 1988, on a mat in Venice, California, became exactly what it was always going to become: a legend.